The term page layout might make you think of web design, but page layout has been around since humans started writing on papyrus, so it predates the web by several centuries. One popular approach to page layout, both in print and on the web, has been the grid-based layout. Grids are popular for several reasons, but primarily grids are about providing structure. Grids define the horizontal and vertical guidelines for arranging content and enforcing margins. They also provide structure for viewers because it's easy to follow a left to right or a right to left flow of content that moves down the page. The grid itself isn't visible necessarily, but it only exists to provide order, alignment, and consistency. Quite often you'll find grids within other grids. That's how much we like grids. And another reason for grids to be popular is that web browsers and grids work well together. Every HTML element is a rectangle. Even if you give it rounded corners, to the browser, every element lays out a four-sided object. If you're familiar with the CSS box model, you'll know this because every element has a width and a height. It has four sides where you can independently set the amount of padding, border, and margin. So a grid-based layout is a natural fit for arranging and constraining rectangles. Bootstrap helps us with grid layout because it provides a container, which we can use to center our content on a page, and it provides a grid system that allows us to lay out divs and other elements in columns. With Bootstrap, we can have up to 12 columns across the display, although you might only use 2 columns or 3 columns or 1 column. Let's see how it works. Inside of our new MVC application, we have a bit of a grid layout happening. It's most apparent here where we have 3 columns of content, getting started, get more libraries, and web hosting. Let's see how that works. I'll start in the layout page because it is the layout page that defines the structure of the HTML. It's here where we render the body. Render body will call a view that actually puts those 3 pieces of content on the screen. I just want to point out that everything in the body is rendered inside of a div that has a class of container. That's a Bootstrap class. There's also a class of body content, but that is not a Bootstrap class. That's something that is in the site.css file and something that Microsoft just threw into the project template. I want to stick with just container. Actually, I want to remove container and save this and refresh the screen. It's going to be a very subtle difference, and it's difficult to show you what can happen without a container because I'm constrained on the amount of horizontal space I have. Without a container, you'll notice the content like getting started is now flush up against the left side of the window, so I really should add some padding there. With a container, what will happen is that everything that renders inside of that container will be set inside of a div that has a max width established. The maximum width will be determined by looking at the device capabilities. More on that in the next clip, I promise. But a container will establish a max width for your content. It will set automatic margins on both sides of the container, and that will center everything on the page. So again, it's difficult to show you on this small video, but try it on your own project on a large display. You can see the difference between having a container and not being in a container. Right now we're back to being in a container, and let's look at how these 3 pieces of content are laid out. It looks like they might be in a table-based layout, but in fact it's just Bootstrap classes. So that comes from render body, which on this home page will render the index view for the home controller. Let's open that up and we can see those 3 pieces of content. They are all inside of a div with a class of row. So the Bootstrap grid system does use the terminology of tables. We think about rows and we think about columns. Remember, in a Bootstrap grid, you can have at most 12 columns in each row. And essentially what we're using on this page is 3 columns. And every time you create a new row, that is content that has to be pushed down the page. So if I make a copy of the existing row and create a new row here, we now have 2 rows of 3 columns. So a new row always pushes down the page. Markup and content that is inside of a single row has a chance at least to lay out horizontally, as we can see with getting started and get more libraries. But again, more on that later. How do we get these 3 columns? That's because when you are inside of a row, you apply classes, Bootstrap classes, that essentially describe how large each column should be. So this is a div that has a class col-md-4. That means it is a column of 4 units. What's the MD stand for? That stands for medium. More on that later. But if I look in the IntelliSense, I can see that Bootstrap provides columns, or classes that is, that can specify columns that should be 1 unit, or 10 unit, or 11 unit, or 2 unit. So everything from 1 to 12. If I make this particular div take up 12 units, then that would take the full width of that row, so everything after it has to be pushed down. We still have those 3 pieces of content, but the first one is just taking up all the space in the row. Everything else gets pushed down beneath it. What happens if I come back and I remove that particular div? Now we just have 2 pieces of content in that first row. They both take up 4 units, and now I have a gap on the right-hand side. And that might be the design that I want. But I also might want Get More Libraries and Web Hosting to lay out so that they both take up 50% of that row. In that case, I would come into the classes and I would say this takes up 6 units. And this one should also take up 6 units. And now they should both have 50% of that row. But of course, it doesn't have to be 50%. I could say that this one should take up 9/12, and this one should take up 3/12 of the row. And I'll get a little more of an offset layout. You can also have nested grids. So I could define a row inside of this 9-column wide piece of content, define a row inside of there, and perhaps 2 6-column wide pieces of content. And what will happen is those 2 6-column wide pieces of content will both get 50% of the available space. So everything is relative. If this particular div takes up 9 units, but then I have a row inside where something only has 6 units, it's essentially getting 50% of this 9-unit wide piece of content. There's also offsets. So let's say I want both of these to only take up 3/12 of the width. But by default, they'll appear flush left like this. But what I really want is to have Get More Libraries here, and then some space, and then Web Hosting on the right side of the row. I can come into the second div and say, let's offset this by 6. Remember, the goal is always to reach 12. You don't have to reach 12, but don't exceed 12. So we have 3 plus 3 plus 6 is 12. And Web Hosting appears on the far right. Somewhat related, there's also push and pull. So let's say for some reason, I don't want to change the structure of this HTML. I want Get More Libraries here. I want Web Hosting here. But when they appear on the screen, I want them reversed. I want Web Hosting to appear on the left-hand side of the page. If that's the case, I could take Get More Libraries, and I could say, let's push you over by 9 units. And Web Hosting, instead of being offset, I'm going to pull you over by 3 units. That will produce this effect. So Get More Libraries and Web Hosting is flipped. I only needed to pull over Web Hosting by 3 units because the first 3 units were going to be occupied by Get More Libraries, but now this was pulled over, this was pushed over to the right. And that's the essence of the grid-based layout with Bootstrap. You have a container, you have rows inside of the container, and inside of each row, you'll have divs that establish the column size for all the content that's going to be inside. And that lets you create a 2-column layout, a 3-column layout, even a 12-column layout, all just using some simple CSS classes.